microphone dropped dramatically in the room, which distracted us slightly there. Evening, welcome to our newsroom if you're here in the newsroom. Welcome if you're at home. My name's Kerry Thomas. I'm one of the editors here at Tortoise, and very grateful to you, as ever, for joining us for this evening's Open News Thinking. As you know, we do thinkings on particular topics most days of the week. The Open News one is a chance for us to look back to something that's recently happened or forward to something else that might be in the news soon. So just a chance to roam around a subject that's caught our eye, or even two or three. So if you've got things you'd like to suggest in the chat that maybe you'd like to talk about, then we're all ears. Do jump in. As ever, what we're hoping this will be is a big sort of open conversation. We don't want to, there's no panel, so there's no risk of it being a panel show, but we don't want a kind of, as you know, we have that one rule, we want your thoughts, your experiences, your points of view. We don't want just a set of questions. So do fire in whatever you've got into the chat. My colleague Phoebe there is looking after the chat. We may pull you out of the chat and bring you into the conversation, or if you want to put your digital hand up, then we'll pull you straight in. There are a couple of things that we do want to talk about tonight. Definitely abuse in the Catholic Church, and hopefully a little later on, I think we want to get to a subject we've covered a little in Sensemaker today, which is the Great Resignation, a phenomenon that's happening both in the US and here, actually all around Europe for all I know, which is just an unprecedented welter of people resigning from their jobs, moving on. And the reason behind that, what it means for employers, what it says about our response to COVID and the lockdown, all those things I think are really, really fascinating. But the main subject on our agenda today is this question of abuse in the Catholic Church. I think that the danger always, I guess, with this is that we yawn and roll over when the latest abuse scandal comes up, because it's been a long, long time now. But I do think the news that came out of France recently is worth dwelling on. You probably saw it. The headline figure was that the commission that investigated the scale of abuse by Catholic clergy in France found that 216,000 children had been abused over a period of 70 years, from 1950 to the current day. And if you included lay members of the Catholic Church, then that figure rose to 330,000 children over that time, which is just, I mean, it's astonishing. If you, like I did, do a little bit of back of the envelope calculation, it means that every week in those 70 years, about just under 100 new children were being abused by someone in or associated with the Catholic Church, which is actually just industrial. It's extraordinary. So the great thing tonight is that we've got with us from the United States, we've got Marty Barron, many of you will know him, one of the great, there's Marty, one of the great American newspaper editors. Back in the day, until recently, executive editor of the Washington Post, further back, executive editor, I think, at the Miami Herald, then certainly at the Boston Globe, which is where the relevance, particularly to tonight's conversation, comes in, because it's just about 20 years, is it, Marty, since you embarked on that great series of reports into abuse by the Catholic Church in and around Boston?
Yes, it was. Our first story appeared on January 6, 2002. So it has been that long. Yeah, a couple of decades.
Yeah, so I'm hoping we can talk about a whole bunch of things. And actually, my colleague James Harding, who Marty, I'm sure you know, is out there, so we'll jump in. I think, James, whenever you want to. I'm hoping, Marty, we can talk about a whole bunch of things. We haven't got a representative of the Catholic Church with us tonight, but I'm interested in what your reflections are, thinking what that reporting said about the Church, the reporting that you did at the Globe, what it said about the relationship between journalism and institutions, and what it said about the relationship between journalism and a particular place like Boston. So I think there's a whole bunch of angles that I'd dearly love to cover off with you. But let me start with the Catholic Church, since it is the thing that's in front of us. What did you come to think about the church through that experience of leading that reporting on them, like we said, nearly 20 years ago?
I guess my conclusion was that the church was determined to protect itself, to protect its leadership, to protect its institutional reputation over all else, over the protection of children, over the protection of families, parishioners, the most devout parishioners within the church, and certainly over the core principles of the church itself. I've seen that survivor groups have called it a betrayal. I think that's exactly what it was. This is not an uncommon occurrence in large, powerful institutions where they endeavor to protect themselves and trample on their purported principles and trample on the rights of people who've been victimized. And so I think that's what occurred in this church, is that they simply didn't want scandal. There was a philosophy of avoiding scandal within the church. And this accumulated over years and decades, and not just in Boston, but throughout the United States and of course throughout the world.
And how many people did you come to think had full knowledge within the church in Boston of what had occurred? Was that calculation that you're talking about the protection of the institution taken very deliberately in your view, or by people with only partial views of what was going on?
Well, I think it's a little hard to say, but I think certainly the leadership, the hierarchy of the church was aware of this practice, and it was a policy to cover it up, to send these priests for supposed treatment. They would then be sent to an additional ministry, another parish. They would commit abuse again. They'd be sent back supposedly for treatment. They would then be reassigned. There was plenty of evidence that that they were not being treated successfully for this, and that the church itself was simply enabling continued abuse. When you look at the sheer numbers of people who were abused by a single priest, it's inescapable. The conclusion is inescapable that these were not being treated in any effective way. So the priest who first came to my attention when I got to Boston was one by the name of John Gagan. He had been accused of abusing as many as 80 kids. The church was aware of that. You can't abuse as many as 80 kids and not arrive at a conclusion that something is not working appropriately, and that you should take this priest out of ministry, not reassign him to another parish. And so there were others who were aware, by the way. I think there are people in law enforcement who are aware. I think there are politicians who are aware. I think there are people in the press who are aware, maybe not to the full extent of the scandal, but they were certainly aware of these practices. I think there are people, even parishioners, who are aware. I can't tell you how many times people have told me that, we always knew that in our church, that there was this one particular priest, and we would tell kids to stay away from him. Or I've heard from people who were young at the time, and they knew among themselves that there was a priest that you worked hard to avoid. So I think the knowledge was somewhat widespread. It was piecemeal, but certainly the hierarchy was aware of the full scope of it. Their own files showed that they were aware of that.
Marty, thanks. Let me bring James Harding in, because James, I think you're out there, and I think we're going to lose you after a little while, so let me take advantage while you're there. I know just from talking to you over a long time now that this story interests you. What is it about this story that grabs you particularly?
Well, I'm going to do something really undignified here, which is basically trying to sort of pick Marty's pocket on how do you do the second half of the story. Because I think that, the truth is the Boston Globe led the coverage on this. And then in country after country, there's been stories of almost exactly the pattern, like word for word, the pattern that Marty describes, including that business of people knowing the priest and you should avoid them, and sort of a sense that individually people take responsibility, priests getting moved. All of that's happened. The thing, Marty, I'd love to know is what do you do now if you're in news, once you've got an institutional report on France, which, as Kerry says, discusses abuse, that's industrial, it's systemic. You then have a response from the Pope, which is in effect a kind of global set of town halls, church halls, right? And then you think to yourself, the biggest risk here is that the scandal is unveiled and then it's weirdly institutionalized. It's just sort of enveloped by the institution, which figures out a way of acknowledging, apologizing, but not really reforming. So I'd love to know, like, how you would sort of direct a newsroom, let's say ours, now.
Well, that's a good question, and very journalistic in your response of providing an answer that's really a question for someone else. So I appreciate that. Unfortunately, I guess I'm not supposed to do the same here. But
it'll get boring in the end.
There are two things that I think about. One is, well, first of all, I've often been asked, how well is the church doing? And I always say that the very fact that we're talking about this 20 years after the Boston Globe did its stories tells you how we're doing, how the church is doing, which is they haven't done very well. If they had done a lot, if they had done something effectively, truly effectively, we wouldn't even be talking about this today. So it tells you quite a bit that this is still an active subject of conversation, and that with every passing month, we learn something new. So I guess part of it is exploring, and this is very difficult, is exploring the institutional barriers within the Vatican that have prevented the Vatican from dealing with this in an effective manner, and explaining why that is. Why is it that 20 years later, we're still grappling with this issue? This is a crime that's being committed here. It's very simple, at least in my mind, is that if you become aware of a possible crime, you report it to police and you allow for a true investigation, a thorough investigation. It's not, in my mind, it's not very complicated. And yet, in the church's mind, it remains somehow complicated. And they're unable to sort of effectively deal with it institutionally throughout the church. So that's number one. Number two is in a way, it's sort of the dog didn't bark. So where is the dog not barking? The dog is not barking in Africa and in Asia, where the church is huge and has been growing, and you don't hear of any cases of abuse. And the reason for that, in my view, is that there is not the same level of pressure as there has been in the United States and as there has been in Europe. There's a little bit more going on in Latin America, but particularly in Asia and Africa, you don't hear about it. And that is because there's no pressure from the press, not significant pressure from the press, and the press is not institutionally as strong in those countries, in that part of the world. And you don't have pressure from government. And so the question is the church really only responding to cases where it feels pressure from the press, from advocacy groups, and from the government, and ignoring what's actually occurring in other regions of the world? And if they were truly dealing with this, we would see active measures taken place, having been taken place in places like Africa and Asia, where the church itself is taking the initiative, hearing of credible cases, which I'm sure they are, and then dealing with them on an institutional basis. And we don't see that at all. And that tells me that the church is largely being responsive to pressure being brought by the press, by survivors groups, and by the government in countries where those kinds of those sorts of institutions are more engaged on this subject.
And Marty, can I just ask one other thing, Kerry, and then I see Greg Mulligan's made a point and Matt Harwood, so I don't want to get in the way. But one quick, Marty, do you have a view on celibacy in the church?
I don't really. I mean, I guess I'm traditional in terms of my journalistic principles, is that I don't really take positions on this sort of thing. So I haven't really. I just don't. I haven't come to a conclusion. I mean, it's not my. I've never felt that it was my place to do so. I'm not Catholic. I'm Jewish. I never purported to tell the church how it should run itself. What I believe the church should do, however, is be faithful to its core principles, which is to protect the weak and the innocent. And in this instance, it did not do that. If that has something to do with celibacy, well, fine. That's for the church and members of the church to grapple with, not for me to tell the church what to do there. So I haven't really dealt with that.
Okay.
But I do suspect, by the way, that, I mean, I think there's sufficient evidence that, people who had sexual issues kind of hid in the church, hid within the priesthood. Obviously not all of them. And I think that would be a shame if we sort of tarnished everybody with that. But I think there's, substantial evidence that people found that a convenient place to hide. And it turns out it was.
James, jump back in anytime, but let me carry on for a little bit because Marty, I said at the outset I was hoping to understand what you thought about journalism in this context as well, because on the one hand, I think many of us would look at what the Boston Globe did in the early part of this century and think it's a journalistic triumph. On the other hand, what had happened in Boston before then and what's happened in a lot of places since then, I think is a real challenge to the notion that we have of American journalism or British journalism or journalism in other countries as independent and fearless and with a central task of holding power to account. In the end, do you come to see this as in general as a kind of triumph of journalism, or is the balance more in favour of the problems with journalism that it reveals, do you think?
Well, both. And I'm not sure how to weigh those two. I do think it was very good journalism on the part of the Boston Globe. It was not entirely me. We had a terrific spotlight team that did the investigating from day one. We also went to court to unseal confidential documents, internal documents of the church itself, and that was critical to our success in terms of showing the magnitude and nature of the cover-up, which is what we were endeavoring to show. It wasn't the first time, obviously, that we knew that there was abuse within the church. Others had written about individual cases. Jason Barry here in the United States had written a book on it. What we were able to document was how that cover-up took place, how deeply institutionalized it was, and the magnitude of the problem just within one diocese. So, and I think that made all the difference in the world. I mean, the natural question is, why wasn't this done sooner? And that does speak to the failures of journalism, and why was it not done in other parts of the world? And quite honestly, I don't think we did our job. I think that prior to my arrival in Boston, somebody should have said, well, let's go after these confidential documents. Why did that not happen? Why was it that after we did our stories that news organizations in other parts of the United States were able to do a very effective job of investigating? Los Angeles is an example of that, an even bigger case, even bigger cover-up than what occurred in Boston, and in parts of New York and in other parts of the country, many parts of the country. And why did that not occur previously? Why did it not occur in other parts of the world? And I think we were deferential, and I think that's. I'm all for being courteous. I'm all for being polite. I'm all for being professional. All for being fair. I'm all for being honest and honorable. But when we become aware that a major institution, a powerful institution, has been credibly accused of grave wrongdoing, we in the press have an absolute obligation to investigate that, to find out what the truth is, and tell people what we have found, and not worry about the possible consequences of that, not worry about the pressures that may be brought against us, not worry about all sorts of loyalties, whether they be loyalties of friendship or loyalties of religion or loyalties of this or that. Not worry about the kinds of accusations that would be leveled against us, such as the ones that the church traditionally had leveled against anybody who reported on improprieties within the church, is that they were anti-Catholic, and not worry about any of that. Just have a strong moral compass and understand what our obligations are as members of the press. Because if we don't do those sorts of things, if we don't have a clear understanding of our mission, and then we also don't act on that mission, then I'm not sure why we have a press. That is the purpose of the press.
And Marty, when you started butting up against those pressures in Boston, I presume the tremendous pushback, I'm sure, against your reporting when it started to become obvious how dogged and how deliberate you were going to be about it. How did you feel those? How were those pressures expressed to you? How was pressure applied to you? How did the sort of all the assumptions of the church or the sort of power structures in Boston, how did they enter the globe? How did they make themselves, what did it feel like to be on the receiving end of all that?
Well, it wasn't overt for the most part. Obviously a lot of the pressure was in court. The lawyers for the church had at one point threatened to seek sanctions against the Boston Globe, even for the act of interviewing priests about cases that had been settled. And that was a bizarre threat, in my view, ludicrous, actually, from a legal standpoint. And obviously we overcame that. There were implications that, with regard to me, that somehow this kind of investigation would not have taken place with people who understood the church, who were insiders as opposed to an outsider, as I was. There weren't explicit threats that I'm aware of. I think a lot of the pressure, as is often the case in journalism, a lot of the pressure is internal. It's like, well, what will the reaction be among our predominantly Catholic readership? Will people be accusing us of being anti-Catholic? Will they cancel their subscriptions? This had happened before at the Globe. It had done an investigation of a priest by the name of Father Porter in Fall River, Massachusetts, and the Cardinal Law, who was the cardinal at the time of our subsequent investigation, as he put it, called down the power of God on the editor of the Boston Globe, who subsequently broke his leg. So maybe that prayer was answered. But in any event, there was a lot of accusations against the Globe for being anti-Catholic, and I think that the Globe was sensitive to that, did not want to be perceived as being anti-Catholic. I had experienced that before in Miami with a case of what was he? I'm not sure what his title was, but he was in charge of the Jubilee celebration in Miami, and he was picked up. He was arrested for soliciting for prostitution on Biscayne Boulevard in Miami, and the church really attacked us. Now, I have to say that our story was maybe a little too explicit about what the exchange was between the police officer and the priest. Nonetheless, we were accused of being anti-Catholic, and that wasn't the case. We were simply reporting a very prominent official within the church had been arrested for soliciting for prostitution.
But I do find that fascinating, because I think a lot of people outside journalism will assume that the pressure that prevents stories being published is explicit, is angry, is in your face. But actually, I agree with you. The problem is as much us and what we internalize, isn't it, as what's explicit and said to us.
I think that's true in a lot of instances. I think that we do internalize this. We do often worry about. There are understandable worries, I guess. They just have to be set aside because we have a strong sense. We should have a strong sense of mission. We worry about the kinds of criticisms that'll be leveled against us, the suggestions that we're unfair, that we're biased. Perhaps threats against advertisers or sponsors, or threats against people will question our integrity, all that sort of stuff. And so, and I'm all in favor of being fair. I'm a big advocate of that and listening to everyone. But I'm also a big advocate for doing our reporting in the most thorough way possible. And then ultimately, when we're satisfied that we've done our jobs, telling people what we've actually found rather than disguising that in some manner or softening it in a way that we're not really telling people the truth. You know, when I think about journalists being honest and honorable and all of that, I think that we certainly need to be honest and honorable with the people we report on. We also need to be honest and honorable with the people we report to. And I think that's really important for us to keep in mind.
Great. Marty, thanks so much. We'll come back to you in just a second. I want to come to Liz, my colleague Liz, who's here in the room.
Hello. Yes, it's interesting talking about the internal pressures. When I read the story about the latest discovery of the abuse in France, I sort of felt the disgust and the anger that I think in general one would expect to feel. But I'm noticing in this conversation and over the last few days, there's no cost to me to feel that disgust and that anger, because I'm not a Catholic. I already have, paedophilia aside, I already have serious misgivings about Christian doctrine, about the operation of the Catholic Church. I'm not down with it, So there's no cost to me to be pointing the finger and going, that's evil. Oh my God, to your point, Kerry, if it was any other organisation, they'd shut it down. And we talk in our newsroom, don't we, about how difficult it is or it can be to believe something that you disagree with or that you don't like, and vice versa. And so genuinely, and I don't think this is a journalistic question of the sorts of things that Marty's been talking about, but I genuinely have been thinking about, I wonder what the best work is that has been done, whether it's scientific research, medical or psychological or academic or whatever, into what is the process that happens inside people's brains. Let's say you are an ordinary Catholic and you read that story. What is the process that you go through to feel okay about the fact that you still are devoting your giving of yourself to that institution that you can empirically judge to be rotten? What is that process? And likewise, outside of it, what is the process that we go through to say, well, we think, there's a reasonable case to suggest that France isn't the last country to discover this, it's just the most recent. Yeah. So where else,
Jump in there, Liz, because I think it's really interesting. And I think I've been looking at what Gregory Mulligan's been saying in the chat. Yeah. And I think Gregory doesn't want to come on camera, but he's talking about how he separates the institution and its behaviour from what he sees around him, what he says ordinary, on the ground Catholics get on with their day-to-day obligations, not automatons controlled by priests and hierarchy. The hierarchy of miles outside his day-to-day experience of the church. So I think I'm sort of ventriloquizing Gregory on the basis of what he said in the chat, but from what he's saying, it's about a separation between the activity and the attitudes and the ethics and ethos among ordinary sort of, working everyday Catholic churchgoers and the institution which is over there. And yes, Gregory says doing something rotten, but separate from my experience of the thing, here and now.
I'm sure that's the case. Same thing in the police, same thing in corporations that are doing terrible things. But an institution doesn't exist outside of the people that are in it. So I suppose that's the thing I hit up against, that especially with a religious, it's your faith. It's a part of, if you're into that sort of thing, your soul. That's a really deep level of personal intrinsic denial you're going to have to go through to get past that, I would say.
Yeah, look, I mean, I've mentioned Gregory and what he said in the chat. I do want to come to Andrew Brown in a second, and James. Yeah, do jump in, James.
Just following up on what Liz said about the police, I think the key thing between the Catholic Church that connects the Catholic Church to the police is this kind of perceived sense of moral authority that both of them kind of draw upon? And is there anything we can learn from each of those two cases? The case with kind of these big institutionalized sexual abuse, etc., within the Catholic Church, and the similar thing within the police. What can we learn from reporting those cases that resonates with one that we could also use to report on the other, that could resonate with the people that Liz said, who have put up these kind of barriers because they're so morally invested in them?
Interesting. Okay. Kira, let me come to you if I can, because one of the things I wanted to ask you, and we might come back to Marty on this in a second, is why, I think as James Harding said at the beginning, you've got this extraordinary fact, which is that the pattern of abuse and response in different dioceses and different countries, it's almost like you wrote it. It's like they wrote it down. It's so similar, as if there's kind of a how to abuse and how to respond is remarkably similar in different places, different jurisdictions, and yet some countries have got to the problem, and some clearly haven't. So we've had France recently. It's striking that Italy still really hasn't had its moment of reckoning on this. But Ireland, where I think you grew up, it has much more so than some countries. So what do you think it was about Ireland that meant that that door was open there when it hasn't opened yet in other places, which were no more, where the relationship between the state and the Catholic Church was no more intertwined than it was in Ireland?
Yeah, I think it's a really big question, because state and church were really married in Ireland. I mean, Ireland, just like the state Republic of Ireland, just over 100 years old. And whenever we were writing the Constitution, I mean, the church had a seat at the table. Like, it really was intrinsic to the institution of Ireland. I think a lot of why Ireland has hopefully moved on is a lot came at once, kind of. So we had not only this systemic abuse that we've seen across the world, but we also had the mother and baby homes and the Magdalene laundries. And then you had the Tuam babies, where it's almost, I think, a couple hundred newborn babies who had died in the care of the church, had been buried in a mass grave unmarked. And so much happened at once that I think it was a real reckoning for Irish people and their values, like, to their core. And it also came hand in hand with the gay marriage referendum, and the divorce referendum was a lot earlier, and then the abortion referendum. So I think there was just this generational moment where people looked inside them and really did question how their religion aligns with their morals as a person. And I do think we've come out of it with a new kind of national consciousness and identity as Irish people that is still Catholic, but less faithful to the Catholic Church. But I did also want to just tell one story to get to the point that you were talking about, Liz. Because this is one that's quite shocking. It was just a year or two ago. I heard of a priest in a diocese not far from where I grew up, who was very elderly, and I don't think he was even doing any of his duties as a priest anymore. Two women, twins, I think, who were now in their 50s or 60s, came forward and spoke about how they were abused by him when they were very, very young. And a lot of the response from people who knew that priest while he was serving, so these people who are also elderly, was kind of, why did you tell us? We don't want to know that. You know, it's been 40, 50 years, you're clearly all right. So why did you say? Was kind of the thing. So I do think there is, as cliche as it sounds, I think there's a certain thing of, oh yeah, it's happening in the Catholic Church, but it's not my priest. And there's a massive disconnect between your day-to-day experience of the church, your day-to-day experience of your priest, the friendly face of the Catholic Church to you, versus the Catholic Church that you read about in the news. And that would be my experience with it. Because I mean, I read about this and I participate in these discussions. Yeah, I have so many fond memories of, I mean, I grew up in Catholic schools and participated in Catholic life. And it's been, by and large, apart from the misogyny, a fairly pleasant experience.
Much like life, really.
Yeah. Like most things.
Yeah. There's a touch of Monty Python about that. But,
Yeah.
But to go back to where Marty started, if the problem was deference, has your the Catholic Church that you've grown up in and around in Ireland, has the attitude towards it still been deferential, or has that gone, do you think?
I think, at least in my experience, it's been less deferential and more that priests are such an important part of your community, really, really important. I would especially say now for, say, like my grandparents, because I know a lot of people have this image of, like, not image, but it is a big problem of elderly people being quite lonely and being quite socially isolated. And in small communities where priests are still an important figure of the community, that's not so much a problem. So every time I visit my grandparents, the priest is around, like every single day he's around, and he's updating you on the gossip from the town and keeping you like involved in everything. And I think that's a wonderful service, really, truly. And at the same time, there's that pit in my stomach that I know that not all priests are trustworthy. So I think it's less that it's deferential and more that people really trust and appreciate the Catholic Church in their life in that respect. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that. I'm going to come back to Marty in a second, but Andrew Brown, if you're there, you were making some points in the chat about I think you were saying some unique problems that you thought, problems that were unique to the Catholic Church in the United States. What did you have in mind?
Well, a bit of background. I was, for, I don't know, 6 or 8 years running the religious bit of the Guardian's website. So I did watch this story unfold. And I did feel that it was more complicated than it appeared. And then last year, there was a really remarkable report came out of the Vatican about the accusations made that the accusation made by a rather unpleasant Italian called Vigano to the effect that Pope Francis had sheltered a man called Theodore McCarrick, who was a very important American cardinal, who was gay, who abused seminarians. So far as we know, there were no children under 18 involved, but we don't know for certain that there wasn't. The point is that this man rose to a position of considerable power in the Catholic Church in America. A lot of people sort of knew about him. A few people knew all about him, and the Church basically just turned away, or the Vatican did. And you can trace this in the course of this report. You can actually see, the memoranda, because when the whole thing blew up, they let a lawyer loose on the Vatican archives that had to do with this. And okay, he was a Catholic lawyer, but he was doing, I think, a pretty good forensic job of finding out exactly who knew what they said, what they reported. Obviously, you can't follow the gossip, but there's an extraordinary paper trail showing how an institution can both know and not know what's going on. And I think this will happen inside any institution. And you have to remember that the Vatican is the oldest continuous bureaucracy on earth.
And when you said at the beginning that it was more complicated than it appeared, was it that sort of knowing and not knowing you were referring to, or something else?
I think it's the knowing and not knowing. It's the fact that if the abusers are each responsible for a lot of children, if I can put it that way, most bishops will only have dealt with 1 or 2 cases in their entire careers. When you drag them all together, it looks like a massive story, but from the point of view of any individual Catholic, until quite recently, it was something that happened somewhere else. And I think that's an important part of the lack of reaction to it. It is also the case that the Catholic Church is not an organization in which the Pope says jump and everybody jumps. Right at the moment, it's in the middle of an appalling sort of cold civil war. I know priests in this country who say, I pray every day for the death of the Pope. There are lots of people who really, really hate him. So an instruction coming out of the Vatican may not be followed. And as Marty said, what's going down in Asia and Africa right now is almost completely unaffected by what's happened in the rest of the world.
Yeah.
I also
couple of things. Can I just pick up on a couple of things? So that view that that the abuse was of a scale where maybe it was mostly happening somewhere else, you'd stand by that, even in spite of what we've heard from France recently, where I appreciate this is over a long period, but it's still a staggering number of children who were involved.
Yeah, but this sounds extremely coarse, but as a proportion of all the children in the Catholic system in France, and I'm assuming, which I think is reasonable, that the cases are not kind of evenly distributed. There will be some priests who abuse a lot of children and other priests who abuse none at all. And if what you know, and this is what I've been told by numerous Catholics that I know, if the priests you know are okay or believed to be okay, you're not going to generalize it to the whole of the rest of the hierarchy. I mean, that's just the way people think,
Yeah, and finally, before I come back to Marty, that within the Guardian, my sort of appreciation of the Guardian is probably a fairly deeply secular newsroom.
Yep.
Does it pass the test of having enough understanding of the institution of the church to be able to report on it properly, or is there a gap there that we need to think about as well, do you think?
I think there's an enormous gap. I think it's largely true of almost all British newspapers, but certainly in The Guardian, it was a place where people would say to me, of course I don't say I'm a Christian here, because it was just a thing that other people did. And I think this did lead to a really considerable lack of understanding.
Yeah, okay, Andrew, thanks for that. Marty, just to come back to you, presumably there was a greater kind of understanding within the globe of the church and a sort of how it operated than Andrew was talking about at The Guardian there.
Yes, I mean, a lot of the journalists at the Globe were Catholics, practicing Catholics. Some were lapsed Catholics, but they had grown up in Catholic schools, so they were very familiar with the church, and some were, proud Catholics, which is, I think fine. I mean, it's great. People are entitled to their own religious views, as far as I'm concerned. So, I mean, so I think people understood the church. We had a very good religion writer there, Michael Paulson, who was not Catholic, but really understood the church. And so I think it's a different environment. I would, by the way, want to issue a bit of a correction, because McCarrick was criminally charged with sexually assaulting a 16-year-old boy during a wedding reception in Massachusetts. That was in 1974 that he supposedly committed that act, and so he did allegedly assault an underage individual.
Okay.
But I would also want to add one other thing, is that I think we have to be, well, first of all, the numbers of individuals who've been victimized is quite large, I think, by any measure. And I also think we have to be really careful not to just get into a numbers game. And it's why in the Boston Globe investigation, what we focused on was not the sheer number, but what was the institutional response when it learned of abuse? How did it respond? Did it fulfill its core principles to protect young people, innocent people, powerless people who were in its care? Or did it not do anything, and in fact subject them to essentially enable additional abuse? And the answer is that they did not protect the children within their care. They exposed them to additional abuse, and they betrayed the core principles of the church. And I think that is the problem, and not, is the number this or is the number that? Is the percentage this, and how does that compare to the percentage in some other field or some other religion or what have you? Numbers are large by any measure, and yet the core issue is Did the church live up to its principles, or did it betray both its principles and its parishioners?
Yeah, no, thanks. Marty, you picked James Harding up earlier on a sort of old journalistic trick of turning an answer into a question. Let me deploy another journalistic trick, which is to ask the same question in a slightly different way, because James asked you what we as a newsroom might look at next, and I suppose following on from what you just said about the response of the church, one of the things perhaps we could usefully do is to look at what happened in the Diocese of Boston after you did your reporting, and was there a better response there than you've seen in other parts of the world? Did you manage to make more change within the Boston Diocese? Might that be a sort of template for what should happen elsewhere?
Sure. I mean, I think what made a huge difference in Boston was that we were able to produce actual documents. We went to court. We prevailed in court. We obtained documents that showed that the church had said one thing to parishioners, saying they were going to deal with these priests, that they wouldn't be again in ministry, and then they lied. They had lied. They put them back into ministry, just somewhere where these parishioners wouldn't see them. I think we were able to show that. And I think that the reaction among most Catholics in Boston was not what we expected. We were not accused of being anti-Catholic. The anger was not directed at us. The anger was directed at the church hierarchy for this act of betrayal, an act of betrayal that had gone on for decades. It's because we were able to produce the documents, we were able to show what the church told its most devout parishioners in their own words, what they had promised them, and then how they had violated and they had broken those promises. And I think that made a huge difference. And then we followed up because the church tried to move beyond this. It apologized, it announced a series of reforms, and we were able to show that those reforms were woefully inadequate, and that in fact they weren't, to the extent that there were any reforms being implemented, they weren't being universally applied.
And if you set the church in the Boston area, the tests that you mentioned before, so does it abide by its own core principles? Does it have protection of children at its heart rather than self-protection? Are you confident now that the Boston Diocese at least would abide by those, would meet those tests or not?
Yeah, I mean, I've been detached from it for quite some time, so I don't have an intimate knowledge of that. But my sense is that the Cardinal Sean O'Malley in Boston, who's now been there for quite some time, is committed to doing the right thing, is my sense of that. It's possible that there are individual cases that will prove to be exceptions to that. But my sense is that Boston is probably among the best at this point because there's been so much attention directed at the Boston Archdiocese. Yeah,
okay. Nima, let me come to you.
Yeah, so I want to say something that is linked to this, but kind of different in that this conversation has triggered something in my memory, where about a year ago, I remember on social media, there was this massive furore, but within a specific community, like within my community, about sexual abuse happening in madrasas, in mosques, but it was specifically happening, like this was like young people coming forward and saying, this has happened to me, I come from this area, let me know if this has happened to you in a similar area. And there was this like, it just kind of, it didn't really get picked up on anywhere else. I feel like if you weren't following those people, you wouldn't have seen it, but within the community, it was like this massive, like seismic moment where people within the community were discussing all these things of like, oh, you went to that one, I know that person that you're talking about, not even by name, but by description of what was going on. And this discussion has just kind of made me think about like these institutions aren't anywhere near as powerful in the UK, obviously, or anywhere in the world, particularly in the UK. So new immigrant communities coming and creating their own faith networks and stuff like that. But I was just thinking about how quickly these things were being like ranks were closed really quickly, and very similar mechanisms were being utilized in much more micro and smaller like cases. And it was really interesting to see how social media and the internet and this kind of democratization of space was being used to actually talk about what was happening. And it was like this explosion of like like networks were being created of like how to keep each other safe without anyone else kind of knowing that this was going on. And I don't know, this kind of like triggered that like memory in me, and I was just thinking about like how on earth do you crack into communities that are even more isolated, are even more like people, it's really hard to get into these communities basically. How on earth do you find out what's going on and who's safe and who's being kept safe when kids are being left for hours on end within, you know, the presence of people that haven't got DBS checks, and, you know, all these things that in any other space would be normal is just not the case. It's like community leaders, I guess, that people who self-describe themselves that way. And I think it's perhaps a much bigger problem than we realize.
Okay. Tom, are you trying to come in, or are you just holding the microphone? You're just holding the microphone. Okay, then I won't bother you. Marty, let me come back to you, because one of the things that occurs to me sometimes, and I throw it in rather flippantly to conversations, but I wonder if there's something behind it, is that if this were another organisation, if this was another institution, we would have closed it down. And I do wonder sometimes whether, I say I make that as a flippant point, but whether actually there is something underneath it which is more important, which is that sense of your own untouchability in the end is part of what someone like you is up against, and part of the reason that remedies have come so slowly, and this thing is still, as you say, you know, far from resolved if you look around the world.
Not my own untouchability. I seem not to be untouchable, but from what my experience is. But the church's untouchability. I mean, well, clearly the church hasn't been untouchable. I mean, look, I don't think that the church has fully dealt with this issue, as I indicated before. But it has certainly suffered immense consequences. It's suffered consequences reputationally. It suffered consequences financially. It continues to be confronted with this, and it's suffered in terms of people going to mass, the numbers, you know, the respect for the hierarchy, whatever, you know, all of that. And so I don't think the church has been untouchable. Would it have been shut down? I mean, there are other institutions. In the chat, it was mentioned that somehow I think that the church has a unique duty to protect the innocent, and somehow I don't think this applies to. Somehow I don't think this applies to others. I don't think that at all. I think that there are many other institutions that have this responsibility, and that other institutions have in fact acted similarly to the church in terms of trying to protect their own reputation. Here in the United States, one of the biggest cases involves the Boy Scouts. And there were enormous number of cases within the Boy Scouts, and the Boy Scouts covered that up as well. And so they're now dealing with the consequences of that. There are universities that have faced cases of abuse. I do think that one of the consequences of the work that the Boston Globe did is that it has forced other institutions, certainly here in the United States, to grapple with these issues in a very different manner. They understand now that you cannot get away with just covering up. And so I think there has been a degree of accountability, maybe not full accountability, but a significant degree of accountability for the church and for other institutions.
Yeah. Andrew Brown, let me come back to you briefly, because I think probably it was you who was making the point that that Marty was referring to there about secular organizations that, exactly as Marty was saying, fell into the same patterns of behavior, fell into the same patterns of response. Is the point you're making that we're holding different institutions to different standards in the way that we're conducting this sort of conversation this evening?
That is something that I do feel, but it's different. I mean, the point is not so much that we should be softer on the Catholic Church, but that there are a lot of other places which have got away with. I mean, if the Labour Party were held responsible for the behaviour of Labour-controlled councils in Lambeth, for example, and everybody said, God, you know, you can't have anything to do with them, that would not, I think, be entirely fair. But it would be comparable to the way that people zero in on the Catholic Church. And it's not, it happens in all religious organizations. Of course, it happens in the Boy Scouts. You might have regarded classic English public schools as a gigantic factory for child abuse. I think that's really what I want to say, that I think that by concentrating on the Catholic Church, we are letting a lot of other people get off fairly scot-free.
Yeah, and actually, just while I've got you there, to pick up on a question that I think Marty didn't want to answer, that James Harding asked him earlier on, which is about the role of, should there be married? This is a debate that's blossomed.
Oh, the celibacy thing.
Celibacy is a word that slipped my mind there for some reason. So that the celibacy question has come back into full focus in France since the report was released a couple of weeks ago. How significant does that feel to you as the beginnings of a solution? Because that's something the Church could fix, isn't it? I mean, that's a piece of doctrine that it could change if it wanted to.
Yes, well, celibacy is discipline, not doctrine in the jargon. That's why it could change it. And there are technically, of course, married Catholic priests. Michael Nazir Ali, the former Anglican bishop, is just about to become one of them. There are already. So the trouble is, I think, that it's very easy. It's very easy to take, when you say, oh, celibacy would solve this problem, it sounds as if the problem of child abuse is basically one brought about by sexual frustration. And I don't think it is. I think the sort of priests who suffer greatly from being unable to make a heterosexual marriage are unlikely to be the ones, not impossible, but unlikely to be the ones who abuse children. There are all sorts of complicated reasons, institutional reasons, why having a married priesthood would be an enormous upheaval for the Catholic Church. But there is the further problem, at least in the American Catholic Church, that a very high proportion of the priesthood is gay there. And whether or not practicing, there's a Dominican guy called Richard Sipe who has really depressing figures on how few priests are actually celibate. So almost everybody is walking around with a bad sexual conscience, if I can put it like that. And this may play a role.
Seems like a very good reason for changing the not doctrine, doesn't it, if that's the case?
Well, they've all invested so much in it.
Well, not enough.
I mean, the last thing. Look, if it were up to me, obviously I would say change it, but I can see why they don't. It's
okay.
Not. Sorry, I mean.
No, it is. It'd be really helpful having you on the call because you do bring a bit more knowledge and a different perspective than some of us have. So, thank you for that. I want to come to Andrew, my colleague here in the room, and then because we're out of time, just quickly back to Marty before we run out altogether.
Yeah, sorry, very very quickly. For what it's worth, I do think celibacy is a bit of a thing, but in terms of the untouchability of the Church, I think the Catholic Church is now having to understand that it needs some sort of reform. And last week, the Pope did announce a 2-year consultation process, which kind of can make loads and loads of people's eyes roll, because you hear of any sort of, we'll enter into a period of consultation, great. But I think that there's something with Pope Francis that I think is wanting to do the progressive thing. So within that, he is talking about more extended women's rights, whether that means women priesting, marriage being on the agenda for priests as well, which in my opinion is a progressive move. There was something really interesting in his address, which I wanted to make sure I quoted right, where he said, "Are we prepared for the adventure of this journey, or are we fearful of the unknown, preferring to take refuge in the usual excuses, it's useless, or we've always done it this way?" Now, I think for me that means that he acknowledges that the Catholic Church has always hidden behind those excuses, it's useless, or we've always done it this way. And he recognises that there has to be some sort of change in and a more progressive attitude towards a few different things, which, you know, with any luck will solve some of these huge issues.
Yeah, great. Andrew, thanks for that. We are out of time. Marty, let me just flip back to you very quickly before we thank you and say good night. In the end, I suppose we have to believe, one of the questions that runs through the chat is is the institution reformable? In the end, I suppose we have to believe that it is reformable. Otherwise, you know, what are we going to do?
Well, I assume the institution is reformable in the same way that any other institution is potentially reformable. I don't know enough about the internal workings of the church to say at what pace that might reasonably occur. One would hope that it could occur at a pace that's faster than what we've seen to date. And, you know, when people talk about 2-year conversations or consultancies, look, we're talking about, it's been 20 years just since what we reported at the Boston Globe. There seems to be an effort to just continually push this off and not to deal with it in the most forthright, direct, rapid manner that it seems to call for. So, but I would assume the church can reform itself if it really wishes to do so, of course.
Yeah. No, I think there's a problem. I worked briefly at Oxford University, and there was one of the problems there is that it referred to itself always as an 800-year-old institution. If you tried to change something in a year, it just regarded it as unseemly. And I suspect that's a sort of get-out clause that a lot of, you know, ancient institutions will play too readily. Hey ho, that's probably one for another day. Marty, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your thoughts. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you in our newsroom this evening, and we hope you'll join us again at some point. But thank you from all of us, I think, for your contributions this evening. Thanks to everyone else who's taken part. It's been fascinating. I'm not sure we've got a clear steer on what we do next with this story, but I think the important thing, I think, is that, you know, I began by saying there is a tendency after these 20 years that we've talked about to disregard news as it comes out and just sort of just to accept that, you know, it's going to be France this week, it'll be Italy at some point in the future, it'll be the Philippines at some distant, and India, and, you know, on we'll go, without ever really reminding ourselves that this is appalling, that of the kind of things that Marty's talked about, the standards we should hold the church to, which are not different from, to pick up on Andrew Brown's point, which are not different from other institutions, but I think given the scale of the abuse that's been revealed, are still pressing and still urgent and still worth us getting into. So we'll decide in the next few weeks how we go about taking this forward. But for now, Marty, everyone else, thank you so much, and we'll see you very soon.